be able to ask questions. So we're looking forward to a very vibrant discussion. My name is Liz Hume, and I'm the acting CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. The session today is called Wired for Conflict, Training for Peace, How Conflict is Hardwired and What We Can Do About It. This is part of our ongoing U.S. Peace, Justice, and Democracy Working Group Wednesday sessions, where we go deep into beyond the talking points and beyond the that 30,000 talking points of what is driving conflict, pulling Americans apart, toxic polarization, what is dismantling our resiliency, our institutions. So these sessions are meant to go deeper than just, the quick talking points that you hear around what is driving conflict in the United States and driving violence. So today we have three incredible women. I just want to talk a little bit about the topic that they'll be discussing, really around neuroscience and our brain. And we think we've evolved, and we think that we are masters of our emotions and how we are thinking about these issues. But it's really important to understand that our brains have a lot going on in terms of how we think about conflict, how we address it, how we react. And I always have this in my head. Mari Fitzduff, one of our incredible speakers today, acknowledge it, but know that we have the ability to change it. And I think that's going to be a big part of the discussion today. So we're going to start off with Mari Fitzduff, who was a professor at Brandeis and started this work going back into Northern Ireland and the peace process there. She's also a senior fellow at the Alliance for Peacebuilding and just really special to the Alliance for Peacebuilding. She has been part of AFP from the beginning. She also has an incredible new book out called Our Brains at War. It is a phenomenal book. I encourage everybody to get it and read it. It explains, you're going to have a lot of what Oprah Winfrey says, aha moments reading this book. Lisa Swallow is the executive director of Crossing Party Lines. She's new to the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and we're thrilled her organization is part of AFP. She has a new book coming out, or it's actually out, so we'll put the link in the chat as well, that's titled, Yes, You Can Talk About Politics. So you can imagine what that book is about. And then Michelle Barsa from Beyond Conflict. And she is the program director there, and she focuses on democracy and social identity. I can't say enough about Michelle's work, Beyond Conflict's work. They are just a true leader in this sector as well. And I encourage people to go to their website, check them out. They have just great cutting edge data on neuroscience in general and how this is impacting the US. So with that, I'm an incredible warm welcome to this panel. And I'm going to turn it over to Mari. Mari, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Liz. So good of you to do the introduction for us. And I'm so delighted to be sharing with Lisa and Michelle, whose work very much overlaps with some of the work that I've been doing. As Liz said, I have produced this book called Our Brains at War. And the reason I did it was because I came across so many things that startled me in the field of conflict. So many situations which just seemed so irrational. People blowing themselves up for the sake of a cartoon or a flag, neighbors turning upon each other with tremendous ferocity, having lived together for decades, young men rolling into violent extremism at a tremendous rate. And they were often young men who seemed perfectly ordered, perfectly helpful, perfectly polite at home among their friends. Why was all of this happening? The book itself is just out. It's got a chapter on a lot of different things. I'm only going to look at 3 of them today as an example. And by the way, don't even dream of buying it without going for the discount. I'll send the details to Stephanie after this if you want to. And frankly, get your library to get it. It's one of these academics books that does cost a little more than usual. So the questions that I had are very much born out of my own situation, where I lived in a place called the Killing Fields. the killing fields was the second highest murder rate in Northern Ireland. And the really strange thing for me was the fact that I was living among what seemed to be regular folk, regular men who would come home on the weekends, who would teach the children their Gaelic games, who would help the grannies do their groceries, and whom I knew were going back at night to kill other people. So this contradiction between how people who seem to be decent people could find themselves in situations where they would feel that they were forced to follow a violent way. Also, I suppose the difficulty of having conversations about this. I've learned it's not just Northern Ireland, but in so many of the 30 odd countries that I've worked in, it is so difficult to have conversations. And of course, we now know in the United States, we too are having difficulty having conversations about conflict and why they matter. Now, why do they matter? Why do the things I'm writing about matter? They matter because they're important to understand for your theories of change. The fact is that you cannot actually address many different ways in situations of conflict without understanding how people feel. And if you're interested, if you think that this is something that just happens in situations elsewhere, I think two processes have happened over the last couple of years that have meant that we have had to look at the situation of emotions. In both Brexit and Trump, people were seeking not to rationally follow their followers' interests, but to appeal emotionally to their instincts and emotional predispositions. We know this about Brexit. People literally went around the country asking some people what they were unhappy about, and then basically saying Brexit was responsible for all of that unhappiness. And as we found out, the debate was dominated by hysteria, hatred, savage encounters, exclusion, ethnic nationalism. I've also written a book about the popularity of Trump, and I think for many of us, that was a startling and puzzling phenomenon. So where are feelings coming from? I have spent years now looking at the neurosciences, looking at where do these feelings that we often don't recognize come from? They're often from unconscious emotions and instincts. For instance, when you lose your temper, do you know why you lose your temper? Particularly when you lose your temper with somebody who's a loved one to you, or with your parents, or with your community. Why do you lose it so easily? Some of our instincts are genetic. We discover that people often react differently depending on their genetics. Some are hormonal, and we often don't have much say in how our hormonal levels exist. And some, of course, are environmental. That's a big debate, and I address it in the context of the book. Why do we have them? Well, very often we seem to see there seems to be a mismatch between feelings we have needed to survive and to grow ourselves as human beings in the past and what's actually needed now. One of the frightening things now is that we're facing environmental disasters, catastrophes. And the fact is that we're finding it so hard to work together because basically we haven't been brought up to work so closely together on a single issue. We've basically been brought up to keep ourselves safe from human beings, from other human groups of beings. How do they affect our behavior? I would say much more frighteningly than we like to think. So I've spent a few years looking at all of the neurosciences. They come in many forms. It's quite exciting. It's a very new field. And one of the first things I say in the book is remember that you can't keep up with it these days. You've got to keep looking, keep studying. So every year we're getting more and more interested phenomenon to actually explain why we find ourselves in so much conflict. I discovered that all of these insights were being used in pretty well everything except the peacebuilding field. So some of you may know that about 5 years ago, I wrote an introduction to neuroscience and peacebuilding. Probably I thought I was going to be challenged on it, but since I got so much positive feedback, I decided to go ahead and write the book. One of the great things about neuroscience, and I speak this as a social psychologist, is you actually can measure people's feelings. Look at the processes that we have on the screen. All of these can be used to measure how we were feeling, how we're feeling now. And for instance, most people will say that they're not prejudiced, but you just bring me an fMRI and I will show you how, unfortunately, that is not the truth for most of us. We differ in how our bodies respond, and we actually thrive along a continuum. We seem to think that some people needed to be probably more fearful than others, because if you belong to a tribe, you need people who are afraid, and you need people who are bold and fearless, and who will go there, chase the lion or whatever, but also people who say, hold on, be careful. And apparently most of our communities are made up of different kinds of people along a continuum in our biology, in our genetics, etc. And these actually influence our beliefs. For instance, there is a gene variant and people who have it, and I suspect many of you who are here listening have it, because I noticed that most of my students who came from 70 different countries all over the world tended to be people who actually were open-minded and enjoyed diversity. But for some people, diversity, for some people, newness is actually a real problem. And those people who are more likely to be conservative are more likely to support capital punishment, immigrant control, bigger military spending. And this is all because their amygdala in their mind actually makes them more fearful. And for instance, you even see this, somebody once said to me, the difference was between Applebee's and Japanese eating. In other words, people who are conservative about eating, conservative about child rearing, and those who are more diverse, those who are more spontaneous. I have to tell you, by the way, that happiness, in case you think, oh gosh, I'm a liberal, not a conservative, the happiness quotient for conservatives is quite a lot higher than that for liberals. There are reasons for that. The second thing I'm just talking about tonight is the whole question of belonging, second most vital need. Most people feel other people belong more than they do. This was fascinating. In a conflict, a lot of people are trying to fit in, are trying to belong, they're trying to choose a side, and they often feel that they're on the edge, that they're sort of slightly outside of the groups, and therefore that makes them even more trying to sort of say that they belong and they agree, and more radical than many others. It brings out newer needs to belong. You've seen this from a situation where, like the former Yugoslavia, people had lived together for decades, but a conflict comes along and they desperately need to find somewhere, even if they're in what we would call mixed marriages, somewhere where they can actually belong and be safe. The need to belong is a major driver of war, and I think diasporas often live on the edge of belonging, and that's why they're often actually more conservative. So the main thing to remember out of this is most people need to belong more than they need to be right. So when you hear somebody saying, and you think, that can't be right, just think what's behind that. What would it cost them to think right in the way that you would define it? I just use this one because, you know, very few, as I discovered, there were some, but most people voted for Trump from feelings rather than from facts. In fact, they actually walked out when he started to talk about policies. So beliefs and memories are in the brain. Basically, for instance, we all think we have memories, but we choose our memories to fit the situation we are in. And you will know in conflicts how people will always choose a constitution, they'll choose a particular historical effect to try and back up what they're saying. So they remember the things that they want to prove their point. So when you think about who is right, just an example is, for instance, we did a poll of a lot of people, 30 different nations, and found that only 9 of the countries believed that Al-Qaeda carried out the attacks. Now, Al-Qaeda, we all assume carried out the attacks. Places, people who lived in many Arab countries, people who lived in Israel, people who lived in the UK didn't believe it. They all believed according to their own beliefs about who they were scapegoating. And it's a costly mistake. And this one, I remember at the minute Hillary said it, I knew he had lost it. The price for not understanding the effect of emotions. Just imagine calling your voters deplorables. Just imagine how you would feel if somebody said that to you. It is such a blow to the confidence you feel in yourself. And no wonder you would turn from that and go to somebody who seemed actually not to find fault with you. And I believe firmly that that kind of emotion drove a lot of people to vote for Trump. Okay, so now just 2 more slides. Within group feeling, how can this help? I remember working in Mindanao and saying to a group of the facilitators, have you looked at the emotions on the within groups? In other words, not between the 2 groups, but within the single groups. And they suddenly realized that with the conflicts within the group, that was a real problem. And this is something we need to remember. It's often the conflicts within Republicanism and the conflicts within the Democratic Party. They're actually the problem, much more in some ways than the conflicts between. If you're doing mediation, I can remember arriving in Istanbul. It was being funded by a UN agency to do some mediation. And because it's so expensive to sponsor mediations, they had not allowed any space in the schedule for getting to know each other, for going shopping, for using the hammam, for sort of meeting in corridors. If you're a mediator, you know you need to develop the oxytocin between people if you're going to achieve agreements. This is so true in case studies of South Africa, Northern Ireland, etc. Dialogue work, though many of you are doing this, remember, if you're doing dialogue work, power has a real part to play. This is our mirror neurons. We can measure them. So we measure 2 groups talking to each other. Let's just imagine Israelis and Palestinians. It could be Protestants, Catholics. It could be Mexican, USA citizens. And what happens is those who have the more power feel empathetic to the other group when they're talking about the challenges they're facing. However, the people who have less power don't feel empathetic to the more power group when they're talking about bombs in buses in Jerusalem, etc. They actually feel empathy for them when they're being listened to. So this is a way of understanding many of the difficult conversations that mediators have, and it points to the fact that you can't really have successful mediations without addressing the structural work as well. The other thing we need to remember is that politicians are always looking, and in the United States as well, are looking at people's emotions in these situations of conflict. So often you have to change the tempo of the public in order for emotions to make different decisions. It's not that the people are for peace and the politicians aren't. The fact is that politicians are listening very closely to think what their people want, and by and large are abiding by that. And I talked about diaspora work. Diaspora work, because their need to belong is so great, they can actually stop agreements being made because they feel that they want the whole solution. And I find that in my work in the United States, I was there for 15, 17 years, the work within communities is often, and particularly within families, I used to say to my student, okay, and the first thing you do before you argue with your aunt or your mother is tell them you love them. Because very often what's the fearful thing is they're going to lose you, you're going to lose them. Within the community, if you think differently, you're going to be cut off from your community, you're going to have to find different friends, etc., etc. So what are the things that result from this? Have compassion for our nature as human beings. I ended up really feeling we are, in a sense, burdened. We are limited by many of our instincts that we don't understand. And the less we understand, the more we're limited by them. Remember, far few people, my own PhD showed this, are changed by logic than by experience and emotions. And this is really important. It's very hard to depend upon logical discussions to change people's minds and feelings. Check the emotions in the room, in the community, in the nations. You can have something else when you're doing an analysis of the conflict. What are the emotions that exist within people and within the groups? Include those that are often overlooked. I've already mentioned in-group feelings are often the biggest challenge, much more so than between groups, and diaspora feelings, etc. Remember, above all, I think anger and aggression often come from fear. That really changes things to understand that. In mediations, the supply of oxytocin is extremely important. Time out, common experiences, music, comfortable corridors, etc. You've got to know who matters emotionally to people and the groups you work with, because they're the people that they're listening to, not the people who are logically thinking through things, but very often the people who are carrying them in their emotions. Don't bother too much with fact checking. People really do often believe what they say. Try and think, what will they lose by changing their mind? So in the United States, just think, what will people lose by changing their mind about Trump, about the Democrats, etc.? And that'll give you a better instinct into what you can actually, how you can actually help these groups lessen perhaps some of their tensions, some of their borders. People need new groups to belong to. One of the things I've done is I've investigated people who've abandoned violent extremism and they've actually moved into dialogue work. And one of the things they found hardest was that they didn't belong anywhere, because they were outsiders within their groups. So finding new places for people to belong is very, very critical and helps them move on. And finally, try to ensure that societies actually produce, that we have societies where people can be at their best and not their worst. Because let me tell you, having been in this field for 30 years, I think there is nobody who at some stage could not be tempted to use violence. And the fact that we don't is very often a matter of our society that manages those conflicts much better than others, and somehow that our needs are met in a way that they aren't elsewhere. So try and ensure that societies, as part of our peace processes, improve the way they respond to people and to groups. So thank you very much. I know that's a lot to take in. As I said, you'll find an awful lot more in the book, but don't dream of buying it without a discount. Okay, thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Mari. I can't even tell you over the years how much I have learned from you. So I can't thank you enough for the contribution you've made to this field.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa, I have the right order, right? Lisa, are you going next or Michelle?
Michelle.
Michelle, sorry, I apologize. I said that wrong earlier. Michelle, take it away.
Great. Mari, I just need you to stop sharing your screen so I can share mine instead.
Right, okay, let me do that. I just have to find out where I can do this. Okay.
Wonderful. All right, let's see now. Okay. Were you able to stop?
Yeah,
somebody else is sharing.
Tell you what, I'll go out, leave it to you, and come back in again. Okay?
Okay. Mhm.
There we go.
Meg, can you, we have somebody who's good at this. Meg, do you know what's going on?
I'm looking now.
Okay.
Give me 2 seconds.
Apologies.
It just looks frozen for some reason.
It does look
Yeah.
frozen. Is it possible? It's frozen for attendees too. Stephanie or Meg, can you hear us?
Oh,
Oh,
we should
there
be.
we go. We're unfrozen.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Michelle Olio.
Okay. All right. Let's see if this works now. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, we did it. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for that talk, Mari. I think you covered a ton of ground in 10 minutes. And I wanted to start building from what you were mentioning, particularly about the neurobiological factors behind conflict, and bridge from the neuroscience to the social neuroscience, exploring how our brains navigate connections to groups, and how that, combined with context dynamics, legal systems, and structures, relates back to democratic legitimacy. And I want to focus on the US in particular, where we're hearing warnings and pronouncements of the crisis of American democracy on a daily basis. This, of course, recognizing that there's this documented trend of rising adherence to authoritarianism and authoritarian beliefs globally, with the US being no exception to that. But when folks are trying to attempt to explain this rise of authoritarianism, the dominant discourse tends to offer explanations that fail to contextualize the phenomenon as in an understanding of intergroup dynamics and social identity construction. And that's what I want to start to go through a little bit today, although we'll only be able to skim the surface. So starting with the basics here, just as a reminder, I'm sure many of you already know this, but what social identity is. We know that it's a sort of portion of the individual identity derived from perceived membership in a group, that usually those groups are defined by physical, social, or mental characteristics. And I think the key point here is that social identity is affected in terms of salience by the social context and by identity threat. So, for example, I'm an Egyptian American. When I'm visiting my family in Egypt, my Egyptian Arab identity is far more salient for me. But in the terms of threat, if I'm back in the US and I see discrimination against Arab Americans, again, that's something that would trigger salience of my Arab American identity, right? So to remember that these things are constantly in flux based on environment and perceptions of threat. And it's with these perceptions of threat, social identity threat in particular, that I want to sit for a minute, because I think this is highly relevant to what we're seeing happening in the US today. So just a bit about what happens when we perceive a threat to our group. Like we just talked about, it affects the salience of our identity, particularly the identity that's under threat, but it also affects the salience and processing of information. So when I perceive myself or my group to be under threat, I'm more likely to scan for threat in the information that I'm processing and receiving. I'm more likely to defer only to very trusted sources, to defer to sources that only confirm this perceived worldview. With that, I'm also more likely to perceive dislike and dehumanization by the outgroup. So I'm more likely to believe that whatever the group is that I think I'm in conflict with, whether that's Democrats or Republicans or what have you, is dehumanizing me. It sees me as less than human, believes that I'm less worthy. They might hate me. I might believe on the lowest scale that they dislike me. With all these things combined together, this is obviously not a linear process, but just for the sake of simplicity here, we see an increased in-group affinity. So if you think about a group that's under threat, when we feel like we're under threat, we gather together with like members of our group and we kind of link arms and say, like, we're in survival mode now. We're going to protect the group because we're under threat. And when we do that, there's a decreased likelihood that we're going to challenge norms of that group. Okay. So at the very moment at which we're talking about social and transformational evolution and change, you're likely to see, particularly with historically privileged groups, this sense of threat that reduces their willingness to challenge and question norms that are otherwise there essentially for survival of the group, to maintain cohesion of the group and ensure that there are clear parameters for group belonging. Okay, so that's all fine, but what does it have to do with democracy, and particularly with American democracy? So this lays forth sort of the American political science of how we come to understand the foundations of democracy as this interplay of the laws that are in place the context of the moment, and then the social norms and values. And so, with context, we've had right now the highest levels of toxic polarization in the last 50 years, a steady trend rising over time. We see the largest mobilization for racial justice since the civil rights movement. COVID is, of course, a major shock to the system. With the laws, we have our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Civil Rights Act, et cetera. And this new wave of laws introduced now around truth, reconciliation, accountability, reparations. And then when it comes to social norms and values, this is the piece that often gets forgotten, and it's been forgotten by science for a long time, right? So in studying political science and democracy, we've overstudied context and laws to the detriment of looking at social norms and cultural values. And it was only actually since the late 1950s, early 1960s that we started asking whether or not it matters, the extent to which individuals and groups internalize democratic norms and democratic principles for the preservation of democracy and the promotion of healthy democratic legitimacy. And then tying this back, of course, we know that social norms are the unwritten rules of behavior shared by a social identity group. Okay, so thinking about identity construction throughout all of this is really important, particularly in the context of threat. So the trends that we see right now, I think you're very familiar with. There's a rise of populism and populist movements, increased adherence of political parties, in particular, not necessarily full citizenries, but political parties to authoritarian norms. The Republican Party is no exception there. A generational decline in trust of national and multinational institutions. We see this changing demographic, particularly in the US, changing demographics that portend a non-white majority in the future. Granted, it's projected for 2042 that white populations would become a minority in the US, but it's been well documented in the social neuroscience and social psychological literatures that social status threat, as we call it, which is a particular form of identity threat, is at play in the ways in which people are acting out with their political behaviors. And we see this other phenomenon in the US that I wanted to hone in on, called we refer to as reduced social identity complexity. And I just want to pause there because it's important, even though it sounds jargony and academic. So when we are members of many different groups, right? And our social identity complexity at an individual level refers to our ability to sit with the diversity of those social identities in the construct of my personal or self-identity, right? And what we're seeing is reduced complexity, reduced diversity, the increased stacking of identities such that they're expected to fall in line with one another under mega identities. So let's imagine, for example, these partisan political identities as mega identities, Republican and Democrat, and then falling in line with those are, for Republican, just generally speaking, white, Christian, often Protestant, evangelical, conservative, pro-life, pro-gun. With Democrat, the sort of stereotypical identity stacking will be minority groups, secular groups, progressives, pro-choice, pro-gun reform, etc. And this feeling that you have to make choices if you want to be a good member of either of these mega identity groups, that you have to fall in line with the group and stay consistent with what's expected of a good member of that group. So keeping all of these sort of cognitive dynamics in mind, what does that take to when we sort of scan out to take us to when we think about democratic legitimacy? Well, it takes us to a slightly different place. And I want to say, first and foremost, this slide is not to indicate that there aren't huge structural and systemic barriers to democratic legitimacy. I wanted to just pull out here some of the psychological underpinnings of democracy that are often overlooked as we try to remedy and repair the systems and structures. And there are three primary underpinnings or psychological orientations that stand out from the literature. Those are political tolerance, or the willingness to tolerate diverse political views in the political arena, equal application of civil liberties. So my interest in protecting, upholding, equally applying civil liberties and civil rights across all identity groups. And then an interest in civic engagement. And I wanted to break these down a little bit one by one. So with political tolerance and equal application of civil liberties, we tend to think that these things are directly yoked and directly correlated. They have some relationship, but they don't actually predict one another, which is to say that political tolerance is primarily born of the extent to which individuals and groups internalize abstract democratic values. Okay, this comes back to the sort of core values, core guiding principles. Do I fuse those values and principles with my identity and with my group identity, right? And then when it comes to the applied judgment of what my values look like in practice, and whether or not I'm willing to uphold those civil liberties and civil rights equally across groups, this really comes down to threat. Okay? So I can sit with this dissonance here. I can have strong values. I can hold democratic norms in high esteem. And at the same time, if I'm experiencing high levels of social identity threat, I'm likely to still be unwilling to equally uphold civil liberties across groups. And this happens on the left and the right. So for example, what you might hear from a more left-leaning constituency, if the Proud Boys want to organize a rally in your town, is no, we can't allow this. We don't want them here. It's contrary to what we believe is true, and it's an affront to our beliefs and our way of life, right? But ultimately, there's civil rights there around freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, et cetera. And this goes in all kinds of directions, but just to point out that it's not unilaterally coming from the right. And the last piece here is this interest in civic engagement, which really comes down to trust. So we know that democracy is essentially just an elaborate structure for participatory decision-making, that robust democracies need citizens who will participate in politics. It's sort of a core belief of the people, by the people, for the people. And so the question is, what makes people willing to engage? And the research shows a couple of things, those primarily being trust in public institutions, which obviously is difficult to have if you are from a racial minority group and those institutions engage in predictably racist behavior, for example. Generalized interpersonal trust, so a belief that people are good, that people are trustworthy, that I can trust others who don't look like me, who are different than me. And then strong norms of reciprocity, which is kind of a more sort of abstract concept within the group. And so we hear a lot about democratic norms in this conversation about the crisis of American democratic legitimacy. And this really calls into question whether or not it's the norms themselves or the social identity threat that's at play, right? And some of the research that we've done some nationally representative, and this is at Beyond Conflict, but in partnership with Dr. Michael Pasek and Dr. Samantha Morberg, is nationally representative surveys in the US, testing for how important people hold for democratic norms: fraud-free elections, equal rights, abuse of power by government officials, and protections for political interference in law enforcement investigations. We ask folks, how important do you hold those norms? How important do you think other average members of your party, your political party, hold those norms? And how important do you think average members of the other political party hold those norms? And what we find is that in actuality, with both Democrats and Republicans ranking how important they hold these democratic norms and average members of their party hold these norms, that there's just a 3-point difference, that for both Democrats and Republicans, we ask them to scale on a 1 to 100, 100 being most important, 1 being not important at all, that the mean sits around 90, 87 for Republicans, 90 for Democrats. We just see a 3-point difference in actual measures. And then when you look at perceptions, when we ask people to project their perceptions of how members of the outgroup of the other political party hold these norms, you see then in those responses a 70-point difference in perceived positions. So in actuality, a 3-point difference; in perceived reality, a 70-point difference. So it begs the question, what in the world is going on here? And is it really about democratic norms? And if so, how we're holding those norms as sacred or as utilitarian or not? And what is the role that threat might be playing in mitigating our willingness to adhere and uphold those norms? So with all that, what to do about it is, of course, the most important question. And in short, we're not entirely sure exactly what to do, but we're trying a couple of different things. And these are some general guiding principles that I'd suggest. One is the recognition that social identity threat is at play, and to actively engage with it through programming. So when levels of social identity threat are high, if you try to move into intergroup dialogue too quickly, you're not going to get anywhere. So like Mario was emphasizing, the work within groups, the work within affinity groups, in groups, to try to bring down these levels of perceived threat, affirm morality, affirm the various sort of psychological needs of individuals and groups in a way that reduces that cognitive barrier to intergroup dialogue and, the sorts of various forms for deliberative democracy. Want to challenge perceptions of partisan group norms. And of course, a lot of this norm setting comes from the federal level, but there's a lot of evidence that you can evolve and challenge these norms starting at a local level. When I'm falling into line in terms of what it means to be a good Republican or what it means to be a good Democrat, I'm basing that on my perceptions of what I think other members of the group think, right? So with, for example, survey data or dialogue or engagement, awareness raising, you can expose that there's more diversity within the in-group than people might believe, which will eventually allow space for people to embrace their own diverse identities and complexities. You want to foster positive intergroup contact. Of course, this comes with all the caveats. There are lots of ways to do this badly. There are lots of things that we've learned from the research that we can go through about how to do this well, particularly in terms of acknowledging power dynamics and contextualizing power within the process of bringing opposing groups or groups that perceive themselves to be opposing together. And then this idea, this cultivation of a renewed superordinate American identity. So it's like you want people rooting for the home team, and you want that home team to be America. You don't want it to be their political party or their identity, their racial group or their religious group. So the question is, how do you construct and reinvigorate this sort of overarching American identity in which people can see themselves placed, in which diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism is contextualized as a core component of that American identity, and where we ultimately can start moving away from zero-sum thinking towards considerations of progress for the greater whole. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I have a zillion questions, but I see there's lots going on in the chat too. So we'll get to those once we hear from Lisa, who says, yes, we can talk about this. And I want to talk a little, I'd like you to also be able to focus a little bit on what Michelle was saying in terms of should we be focusing in more on the in-group right now instead of that interdialogue? But I'd like you to, since you wrote the book, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. You're on mute, Lisa.
Yeah, I want to apologize. I had a system crash and I'm trying to recover from that, but I think I've got it figured out. Just give me one moment.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm going to have to do something just a little bit different. I'm not able to actually show my slides in a presentation view with this laptop that I'm having to use. So
do you want to send them, can you send them to Meg and she can put them up?
Actually, yeah, Meg actually has them. Meg, would you be willing
Meg, can you put them up?
Yes, give me 2 seconds. Sorry, it's loading it on my end, but should be any second now.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Well, do you want to start, Lisa? And then Meg will catch up with the slides.
Yeah, thank you. So first off, I want to thank Meg for helping me with this, and Mari for her presentation on neuroscience, and also Michelle for the wonderful work you are doing. My work is coming at this from a completely different angle. I help individuals learn to talk across differences and focus on what are the teachable skills we can use. How can we actually empower individuals to learn how to manage their emotions in a way that will allow them to show up in any kind of conversation as their best self. So next slide, Meg, thank you. Before we dive into how it is that we can actually talk across differences, I want to take a moment to talk about something that Mari introduced, which is the concept of emotional hijack, also called fight or flight. The mechanisms behind that have to do with, I apologize, I'm so frustrated with not being able to see my slides. So our brain is a set of interacting systems, and the two systems we're going to focus on today are the neocortex, which manages the reasoning part of our brain, and how we reason, how we have creative thinking, and how we use logic. The other part is the limbic system. So Meg, if you don't mind, thank you. And that manages our emotions and helps us to identify threat. Meg, thank you. Next click. Yeah, thank you. The two structures interact with one another through the amygdala, which is that gatekeeper between the systems. The amygdala will evaluate sensory inputs, comparing them to stored memories. And when it encounters something that it considers important, it sends signals to our body and our brain, preparing us for the appropriate response. In the case of threats to our safety and well-being, this means preparing us for fight or flight. Next slide. To the amygdala, any of the following are considered threats: sudden, startling, and out-of-place events, something that is unknown or different, emotionally charged, or similar to previous dangers or threats that we've encountered. The amygdala doesn't distinguish between different types of threats. It responds to all threats the same way, whether they're threats to our bodies, to our identities, to our ideas, our lifestyles, or our beliefs. Next slide, Meg. Compared to our neocortex, the lightning processes sensory inputs at lightning speed. It completes its assessment before we're consciously aware of the inputs, which means our initial reaction to stimulus tends to be based on emotion instead of reason. When it detects a threat, the amygdala throws us into fight or flight response. We experience anger, aggression, or fear, and the amygdala then diverts our physical and cognitive resources away from non-essential body parts and brain parts, which includes the neocortex. So we become illogical and irrational. We stop forming long-term memories and therefore cannot learn. And according to the neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman, it's as if we lose about 10 to 15 IQ points. What's worse is that we aren't even aware that this is happening. Next slide. It does very little good to look at these two parts of the brain separately. What we have to do is look at them together and understand how they interact with one another. We've seen that the limbic system can divert resources away from the neocortex. The neocortex cannot divert resources away from the limbic system. However, neocortical activity does influence how the limbic system identifies threats and how it responds to them. Next slide. Training for peace requires that we understand the types of brain activities that can influence the reactivity of the limbic system. These include creating memories, developing new skills and habits, and cultivating new thoughts and intentions. I have chosen to represent these as gears because these all impact one another. So while we can perform these activities independently, we can't isolate them in terms of how they affect our brains. We can't separate skills from memory or memory from thought, or thought and intention from those skills. Next slide. Memories form the database against which the amygdala measures a situation. One of the most powerful tools for reducing hardwired conflict is to create new memories. For example, we can expose ourselves to new people and new ideas. We can seek out examples of civil, respectful conversation between differences, and we can join groups or communities where diversity of thought is accepted and appreciated. Making these types of rational, strategic changes to the database that the amygdala uses to identify threats can reduce the emotional charge associated with specific situations and help us be less reactive to others and normalize interactions involving differences. Next slide. We can develop new behaviors and skills, get to know our personal fight and flight styles using mindfulness or self-awareness. We start by noticing what triggers us and learn to spot the physical and emotional signs that the amygdala is preparing us for fight or flight. We can resist slipping into fight or flight through self-regulation skills, such as calming our nervous system, engaging our frontal lobes before the amygdala completely shuts them down, or making conscious decisions to step away from an interaction rather than participate with our less than perfect selves. And we can avoid fight or flight completely using active listening, which can redefine the goal from defending our ideas to learning about the other, or I statements that let us express our views in terms of why they make sense for us rather than why they are right. Lastly, we can adopt critical thinking skills to influence how the amygdala differentiates between ideas that need to be defended and those that need to be explored. New slide. Finally, we can influence the reactivity of our limbic systems by becoming intentional about our interactions with others. Anticipate how interactions can unfold and rehearse them before we respond. An intention to defend sets our amygdala on high alert, priming us to see danger and threat where it may not even exist. Whereas the intention to learn prepares us to be open to new ideas, even if it makes us uncomfortable. So expect to hear ideas that are new and different. Prepare to listen more and talk less. Put time into developing skills that reduce conflict, and join groups or communities where diversity is accepted and appreciated. The previous slides have introduced some of the things individuals can do to reduce conflict in their personal and professional lives. As the co-founder and executive director of Crossing Party Lines, my work also focuses on what organizations can do to reduce hardwired conflict and train for peace. Today, I'd like to focus on 3 of them: forming communities, creating brave spaces, and normalizing and amplifying our work. Next slide. It's impossible to overstate the importance of community. As we've learned from Michelle's presentation, threats to our social identities are a primary source of conflict. And as we've learned from Mari's presentation, for most people, it's more important to belong than to be right. The concepts and skills I've presented here and in my book prepare individuals to align themselves with communities and that foster peace and collaboration. In order for them to do that, organizations must provide the groups and communities for them to join. These new groups must encourage allegiance to a party and other subgroups instead of discourage them. They must be superordinate so that everyone can join regardless of where they stand. Vitality for this group depends on them being founded on shared goals, providing opportunities to contribute and build friendships, and they must be held together by community norms, including civility and respect. Next slide. Next, we must provide brave spaces, not safe spaces. While a safe space is designed to keep people from triggering and being triggered, a brave space is designed to provide opportunities to grow beyond triggering and cultivate the types of peace-building habits and skills and intentions that we've just discussed. In a brave space, it's safe to learn from mistakes. I use the term space loosely to refer to opportunities more than physical spaces. While there are many types of brave spaces, some key characteristics include predictability, that is a standard format or regular meeting times, and a design that is focused on reducing friction and strife. At a minimum, we must make sure that authority is distinct from participation, that there are guardrails in place, for example, trained facilitators, published guidelines and rules of engagement, and that all participants are given equal opportunity and equal treatment. Next slide. Lastly, organizations must amplify peacemaking. The polarization affecting America and much of the world today has resulted in a dangerous lack of faith in peacemaking and bridge building. Even talking to the other has come to be seen as disloyal, pointless, and fraught with danger. To gain traction in our efforts, we must overcome this perception and help people see our efforts as beneficial, effective, and something they can participate in. We must increase the visibility to our work, our ideas, and most importantly, our successes. We must celebrate our members and announce opportunities to participate. And we must amplify the voices of all groups and individuals doing this work. Next slide. I use the gear imagery in this presentation, hoping that if you take one thing away from it, it will be the importance of adopting a multifaceted, multidisciplinary, and multiple perspective approach to peace building. We need to resist the natural urges to simplify and take sides. We can no longer enter into peace building thinking that there's a single right approach. We must embrace not just the complexity of the conflicts we're attempting to resolve, but also the complexity of conflict resolution itself. No one organization will end polarization, no single action or treaty will end conflict, and looking at issues from a logical perspective while ignoring an emotional one will not get us where we need to go. We need to work together, making sure each effort supports every other effort and all contribute to reducing conflict. Today, I didn't have time to present any of the scores of activities and exercises I use to teach the concepts and skills we've been talking about today. But Megan, I hope you will paste the link that I provided into chat. You can use this link to download Lessons in Listening, which is an excerpt from my book, Yes, You Can Talk Politics, and that's free. And thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, everybody. This was fascinating. I just want to go over a couple things. It's more important to be long than to be right. That was something that I think came out. And I think if you didn't believe it or know before, it's clear that social identity is in play. Your emotions, your hormones, these are all part of the conflict, and we have to understand them. And then more importantly, how to deal with them within our own organizations on a personal level, and how we implement programs. So I think that that's really important. And I think one of some of the most important things that came out of this discussion is that this is not a right or left or more people on the right. It's both left and right. And we probably have to do a lot more in-group work before we can even get to the outer dialogue work or the inter-group work. So there's a lot more here that I can go through, but those were just some of the, the notes that I was pulling out. So what do we do about this now? Now that we've come to agree that, these issues are here, how do we move forward with this? What are the key, early, if we want to look sort of at the early leverage points, middle, longer term, what would you guys, if you had all the money, what would you say we need to do first, second, and third? Anybody? Mari, jump in.
Okay. I just wanted to talk about an example that really framed the way we did our work in Northern Ireland. It was early on in the work. We brought two groups together, Protestants and Catholics. The Catholics were politicians, the Protestants were clergymen. And before the streets were rife and there was violence on the streets, it was stone throwing, it was bullets, it was British Army. And before we had a chance really to start, one of the Protestant clergymen stood up and he said, Mary, he said, I don't know why we're bothering being here. We know what you want. You just want us to go back to Scotland where we came from 300 years ago, and we have nowhere to go. And what was fascinating is that Protestants were seen as the people with the power, the people with the status, the people with the jobs, the people with the money. What the Catholics had not understood was their fear of being seen as outsiders. And I think one of the things, the conversations that has to happen within the United States is really the fear people have of a future that they won't understand, that they won't belong to, that will be taken over by people who are a different color to them, who have different ideas. I mean, that is just so much at the root of so many causes of conflict. So I think the sense of how you can open up so that people who are looking at those who are more conservative, who are afraid of change, and understand this, not as seeing them as the enemy, but seeing where their feelings are and what has to be done with it. And I think the second thing is, in order to stimulate this debate, one of the things that's come across to us in the work is the people who are best at beginning to help people to open up are people who are closer to them, respected to them, have some similar ideas. So for instance, if you have, we had a lot of Christian evangelicals, so to have people who are atheists or agnostics talking to them, they couldn't be trusted, they couldn't be believed. But actually getting people who were fairly similar to them in their basic outlooks and beliefs and ideologies actually made it much easier for them to listen to each other and to the people who are facilitating these conversations. So those are the two things, bringing the feelings somehow into the room and knowing, by the way, that you can deal with them. As a mediator, it's not always easy. But the second thing is also realizing that, wherever people are going to go, they've got to have alternative ways of being respected and belong. And I think that those two are really critical.
Mari, just really quickly, alternative ways of being respected. Can you pull that thread?
Well, I mean, this comes from much of the work that we've done in terms of violent extremism, where in fact, violent extremism was often what I would call a heroic urge, a need to be a hero. And my own work showed that, in fact, while some people responded because there was injustice to their community, others responded because this opportunity of a conflict gave them a way to be heroes. Now, it's actually different. I think in the United States, there's a different psychology between heroes who are part of a group, which you're talking about is quite different to individuals who tend to be on the sort of individuals who are violent in the United States. The studies seem to show that they tend to be loners. They tend to have a bit of sociopathic tendencies, whereas those who belong to groups I was fascinated to find, for instance, that many of the people who joined ISIS from Europe carried Islam for Dummies in their backpack because they hadn't a clue what Islam was for. But what they wanted was the adventure. What they wanted was the group. And we often find that actually we did, many of our ex-paramilitaries here, once they left violence, they actually became warriors for peace and found a different way of actually being a hero in their communities. So it depends on your age, it depends on your context, but there are always, if people can rise to it, there are always different ways of helping them to move slightly from one group to slightly to another group.
Okay, and one of the things you also talk about, I know you've talked about a lot, focused on finding a new way to do the heroism, whether it's the white helmets, for example.
Yes.
Again, it goes back to the issue that people are looking to belong, and it's channeling that way. Lisa, Michelle, do you have any thoughts on the question I posed?
I think two things. I agree with Mari completely about bringing emotion into the discussion. And one of the key things that we teach is to talk about not why we care about what we care about, but where those views come from. And those are generally our emotions, our fears, what we're concerned about, who we're worried about, what problem we're trying to solve, and why that is so important to us. So that starts bringing feelings in, and most people we run into don't know how to do that. So we have to teach them the skill of learning to talk about their feelings. I think the second thing, though, is we need to normalize peace building. Make it heroic, as Mari is talking about. It isn't being seen that way right now.
Normalize peace building. That's a great quote. And also, you had a phenomenal quote before. I took a note on it. Is brave spaces, not safe spaces.
Yeah,
I love that. Like that was phenomenal. So thank you, Michelle.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think a super satisfying answer here, but I think there's a couple things. The first is to see us evolve in the field of peace building and dialogue to distinguish more effectively between sacred values and utilitarian values. So to understand when we have values that are fused deeply with our identities and our individual and group identities, that we can't come at them with utilitarian tactics. That in fact, they need to be dealt with in different ways, with other types of symbolic gestures, and with other types of breaking down like what ultimately is held as sacred, whether it's the moral imperative or the political position itself that's sacred to you and to your group. And to distinguish that in a way that's reflected back in programming. I think there's also another distinction that I think is really important, and that's between normative belief and applied normative practice. I think we're defaulting to this belief that are like groups that we believe to be antagonistic like don't have norms and values. They don't share these norms and values that we see as core. And I think what the science is showing, though, you know, to be fair, like the evidence base isn't fully there, is that in fact, people can hold these normative beliefs as important and essential and core while still using selective judgment in how to apply them. And I think like we need to be a little bit nuanced in how we're breaking down where that's falling apart, because when we're using norm-based interventions for things that are threat-driven behaviors, we're probably missing the point. And I think I'd also, it's interesting, like social identity threat and social status threat in particular, we tend to look at resistant populations, majority white populations, historically privileged populations, and how that affects their resistance to transformative or progressive change, right? But it's also something that factors into the way that social movements function, the kinds of conflicts that exist between social movements and peace building movements. And I think sort of we need a new framework for understanding the social ecosystem of change in which each of these movements sits, which is to say that all of these various factors are at play. We need the structural change. We need the legal reform. We need the social norms change. We need the cajoling of resistant populations by reducing levels of social identity threat. And that these things, even though the tactics and aims may feel at odds in the present moment, that are in fact complementary in a broader ecosystem of how we transform our society.
Sorry, I was muted. Michelle, talk a little bit about that. You said these things might seem at odds. Why do they seem at odds?
So we talk about, you know, with social movements, and that was my background before I got into peace building. We need to polarize to organize, right? It's like polarization to some extent is healthy in an open democracy. Like you want to polarize people when there are things that, when there are practices that seem to be at odds with your core values and beliefs, right? And we polarize people to get them to stand up. We polarize to get them out of a complacent position and get them to act and organize for change. With the peace building community, you want to try to bring down the heat, right? We're trying to reduce fear, increase warmth. We're trying to enhance understanding. And so there's a lot of scapegoating of social justice movements to say, like, the language we're using is too polarizing. It's not helping. We can't build bridges. And then the social justice communities looking back at the peace building communities to say, like, you're here to maintain the status quo, which is oppositional to the kinds of transformative change that we're trying to achieve with the messaging narratives and advocacy frameworks that we've laid out. And I think there's a lot more sort of connective tissue between the strategic approaches to evolve sustainable change at a mass level, and that it's not in fact one or the other. And I think we waste quite a bit of time trying to convince each other that one is right and the other is wrong, without trying to convince how each other, like how these things complement one another, even if we're doing that coordination and collaboration in private, to be honest, because sometimes publicly it's not viable.
Okay, excellent point. There's some questions that coming in the chat. William talks about, is there a difference based on political orientation on the willingness to develop new memory skills and intentions? Like a difference between people who are willing to attend something like this or not? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, we do see, Mari referenced the fact that we do have different makeups in terms of genetics and physiology and things like that. And we do see that tendency to be open to new ideas and trying new things does seem to be more in the liberals or progressive makeup than conservative. But we find that with when we present these opportunities to create the new memories, to participate in events like this in the right way, tapping into the moral foundations that are at play for conservatives or libertarians, they are just as open to it. It's just a messaging problem. How do we communicate the value in this in a way that makes sense to them and connects to their values and their beliefs? So it can be done, but we're having to work on it, because most of the people doing this kind of work do tend to skew liberal, and their communication style often doesn't work for bringing in others, and we have to find conservatives who want to do this work and ask them to help us send the message out.
Can I add to
Marie, go
that?
ahead.
One of the things I think that helps us to set our priorities is to recognize that actually conservatism is the norm in most societies. That's it. And there's a reason for that, because the societies that have survived because they have learned what works, they're careful to adhere to that, et cetera, et cetera. And also with any group, there's also only going to be a few who are liberal. But the interesting thing is you'll find in terms of the studies showing that in terms of people's appreciation of human rights, people appreciate human rights much more in, for instance, the Western, more wealthy Europe, Scandinavian countries, et cetera, because liberalism, in a sense, is a luxury for our society, many of our societies now, and it's other people just don't have the sort of the capacity to think through in terms of being as free as that. So I find it really helpful to realize that people are conservative for very good reasons, for survival reasons. I think the other thing is that has struck me is something that has served us in the past, what we call parochial altruism. In other words, we are open, but mostly to our own people, and there's a lot of work showing this, is that obviously we've broken through that a narrow circle many times to become, for instance, to move from tribes to nations. It's actually quite extraordinary that you can have a nation of people who feel part of a nation. And that's why leaders go to such trouble with flags and songs and because it's not that natural to feel related to 50 million people or 350 million, but nations have done it. I think the problem now is how that belonging can be moved even higher in terms of the environment. Because the problem is that a parochial altruism is actually hindering our steps in terms of the environment. And are we sure that we'll be able to make that step, which is really about the whole of the earth, as it were? And that's one of the things that worries me. The fact that we've managed to make those jumps in the past is quite reassuring. I'm still just hoping and not totally sure that we'll be able to make this step as well.
And Mari, you raise an excellent point. What about conflict in general? I mean, we talk about climate, but the world is experiencing a global violent conflict problem. I mean, we're not, we measured it, before in terms of World War II or, so no, we don't have those levels of conflict, but we have violent extremism. We have mass migration on the rate that hasn't been seen since World War II. We have 1 in 33 people today needing humanitarian assistance and protection. I mean, these are beyond World War II numbers now. And you have regional conflicts, intra-conflicts. So we also, as not only are we seeing increasing conflict in the United States, we have a global conflict problem that is impacting everything in terms of the climate as well. So, and our ability to respond to COVID.
And Liz, you forgot to mention social media. What social media is doing. I have a chapter on social media because I think that it may be one of the process that really worries me the most. Because in fact, we have, I mean, let's be clear, Steven Pinker has written a book called The Better Angels of Our Human Nature, showing that, in fact, by and large, we live more peacefully. On the other hand, social media gives a capacity for every person with a computer to actually involve themselves in a conflict in which there'll be no consequences for them to say, go ahead and kill this group, or et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is the other thing. And also our natures haven't caught up with social media. We are fooled by it. There's a lot of evidence we go for things that are sort of horror-filled rather than things that are peaceful. A lot of the work doing on social media really is something that it also, but the thing, in a funny way, we are now having less wars because we've now realized that major wars don't get us anywhere. I mean, the whole question of bringing down the United States with 11 scissors that can open parcels, or bringing down Saudi Arabia with a few drones, we are in the midst of a revelation about how wars are actually won or lost. But I just do want to say social media can make that worse. I do think the immigration problem is very significant. I have this dream in Europe. When Europe wanted to set up Europe, it realized it had to bring the poor nations along, like Ireland and Portugal and Spain, etc. It spent about 20 years helping them to develop, so that when it opened its borders, then in fact people wouldn't come rushing in to all the wealthier countries, France, etc. So my sense is we are looking towards open borders but we have to probably work a few decades to make sure that we help other people create their societies. So they have the condition that Pinker will talk about in terms of institutions that can solve conflict, institutions that match basic human needs, and that in fact that actually will help us in terms of absorbing the whole question of liberty. Frankly, the borders aren't working anymore. We can easily get over them, under them, through them, planes, boats, etc., etc. And really looking at what will make it easier to have these borders open in a few decades is probably where we are.
No, and absolutely right, Mari. Our laws and regulations have not caught up with social media as well.
Absolutely.
And with regard to Pinker and his book and his theories, I mean, I also talk about the fact he's measuring it based on old world, going back into World War II.
That is true.
I think you hit it on the head in terms of the, it doesn't encompass violent extremism. It doesn't encompass also, the attacks on infrastructure now. What we just saw on the gas pipeline in the US. And how easy it was to disrupt that. There's a brave new world out there with a lot of conflict dynamics that even our field itself hasn't kind of wrapped our head around yet. So,
and just a tiny pointer there of hope. Many of the generals I talk to in the United States and the UK know this. They know they've got armies that aren't fit for what needs to happen today, and they are trying to think it through. We actually find that the army are saying to us, will you tell your politicians we don't want more guns, we don't want more ammunition factories, we want more soft power, we want more diplomacy. The retired generals are all telling us to persuade the politicians. So somehow that conversation also has to happen.
Okay, so some questions that are coming in. Pamela talks about one of the things that she wanted to talk about was train facilitators to know themselves deeply and process their own traumas. I agree with this. I think that a lot of people jump into the peace building field or the conflict prevention field and don't understand that there's a lot of research and theory behind it. They have a great idea and it would work on their brains, but not necessarily others. Also, Pamela talks about, but emotions deserve an A, not an F. They tell us what matters to us, and in real groups, they will be strongly expressed, as in Oslo. When emotions are validated, they settle down, the rational brain kicks in. I mean, how do we do that then? How do we, in our own programming, what would that look like in practice?
Lisa?
Yeah, what we see, it's really a matter of listening. We first train people to listen to one another, which is why the free download I'm presenting is Lessons in Listening. Unless people feel heard and understood, and that means on an emotional basis, we're not talking facts and logic, they're not able to calm their limbic systems and listen to others. So I really think that the focus on listening helps more than anything else, especially when people are trained to listen, to truly understand without judgment, and to validate without thinking that their validation is an implicit agreement with whatever that person has to say.
Okay, but how do you ask people to listen who feel traumatized, who feel that they've been repressed? Because, part of this whole issue around dialogue is, there's, and I've learned this from Tim at Beyond Conflict. He's talked about this, you have to, there has to be a power dynamic that's very equal, that a lot of this research has not been done, in the United States. It's very context specific. So how do you start that? How do you ask a community who has been discriminated against or traumatized to listen?
Actually, I think we start by listening to them and giving them a voice. So part of the trauma comes from not having a voice, from not being heard, from the basket of deplorable statements. Mm-hmm. We need to listen to the traumatized folks first, but they need to be given not just a voice, but a voice that others are listening to. So if they know that people in the room are coming from different places and are willing to listen and listen openly, they start to feel heard. And I think at that point, they can grow into and evolve into a place where they can listen to others but it's a healing experience. It's not really about logicking them to where they can participate in that way. It's giving them the opportunity to heal through the traumas by being respected and given that voice. At least that's been my experience, but I really want to hear from Mari with her broader experience.
First of all, two things here. One of the problems about this is I think we have to realize we have to challenge our emotions as well, because our first emotion is often fear, as you would say, when we meet someone who's different. And actually, we do need to immediately say, but that comes from somewhere else. I realize this person is part of my society, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think we have, a lot of us feel bad when we recognize difference, but it's not the feeling that's bad. The problem is what we do about it. And in fact, moving beyond that initial feeling, for instance, we all know that interviewing people instantly know a person who walks into the room, they feel comfortable with them. If they acted on that feeling, they would probably appoint people who are just like themselves because they felt comfortable with them. So I think that's one of but the other thing I do feel very, very strongly, and I must say in the book, it's a big caveat for me. By and large, we are disrespecting people if we listen to their oppression, as it were, and say terrible thing that this happens, and then don't help them address it. I mean, I have spent nights with groups saying to groups who felt that they were the least, they were most vulnerable in society, saying, we want justice, we want our rights, we want people to respect us, and the other saying, there, we think you're lovely. That's a bit of a caricature. But, we also have to help people to actually, and shift our own society as well, so that we can include people, because all the evidence showed the more equal that people can feel, the more effective those conversations. But the second best thing is to recognize that it would betray our work as peacekeepers if we were just to go in to feeling good about each other and not to recognize that that means we actually have to take on board the challenges that people face in their society, which are making them feel so traumatized, and also making, in many cases, them taking up violence. So,
because you can actually do harm that way.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Michelle, any you want to jump in here? Or do you have any comments or thoughts? It's okay if you don't, but I just wanted to make sure that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of my colleagues the other day, neuroscientist, said, healed people seek a different type of justice. And I think that's true. And I think that we undervalue the various modalities that we have available to us for trauma healing, particularly at a collective level. And that we fail to recognize the role that social movements and mobilization can serve for collective healing, particularly for historically marginalized and historically traumatized individuals. We fail to recognize the role that trauma plays in the strategic and tactical choices that social movements will make, and that that contributes to a lack of understanding on all sides, particularly like on folks on the left and the right, of what's actually going on in historically aggrieved communities. I think we need to really take the work of trauma healing out of the clinical realm, where we tend to situate it with our fancy psychologists and meds, and really embrace the role that we can play as members of communities in trauma healing, and think more intentionally in the peace building, human rights, and justice work that we do about how we factor in trauma healing intentionally to the strategy, structure, and normative environments that we create.
No, absolutely. Go ahead, Mari.
I think if one of the things I feel quite strongly about in terms of dealing with trauma, and I mean, in Northern Ireland, we had a choice in terms of would we fund groups who would look at the trauma they had suffered. But in doing that, we found that such groups, they shaped their identity as victims, and they often became paralyzed in terms of social change. So given that how much was happening outside the doors in terms of violence, we actually brought groups together deliberately who themselves had actually been part of some violence, to see how they could change the situation for themselves and for their children and for the future. And I think we were lucky in that Northern Ireland is quite it's a UK relatively wealthy place. So people who suffered very significant trauma, we actually had the means for them to deal with it. But community trauma, I think, work is actually more powerful, because they recognize that sort of violence is not individual violence. It's a community problem. It's a community conflict, and can only be dealt with by the community. And I think that in doing that, you'll find that people, in a sense, found a way to move themselves more quickly into capacity. I mean, my worry about the difficulty, I have seen people who have become victimized almost in perpetuity by the fact that they were spending so much time looking at what had happened to them in the past. And there are obviously places for that to happen, but we do have to be careful that it doesn't form people's identity, and therefore they become what we would call, helpless in terms of how they deal with life.
Great. There's a question, and it's interesting. Can anyone work in the peace building field, or does it turn out, is it easier for some kind of people or their personalities? And I also want to just comment on this. Working on things in the US has been incredibly humbling, because you realize, things that you worked on or were doing overseas, you don't know how hard it is until you try to do it in your own country. So it's very, very humbling. But one thing that I have seen a lot is a lot of people in this community now that are already working here are struggling between social justice and peace building. And I see that tension a lot. And one of the things I always say, if you can't have empathy and understand that you have to look inside rural communities, like what's happening in Southern Ohio, if you can't have empathy and try to understand that they're part of the conflict dynamics, then don't go to Srebrenica and tell people that they have to reconcile. And I see that struggle happening a lot. So I want to understand, how do we talk to our own community about people practicing, and also who is best placed to do this work? Any thoughts on that?
I think that has to be from some of our American colleagues, some of our colleagues from the USA or South America.
No, you can talk to us, Mari. I mean, Americans have been going around forever telling everybody what to do and what. I mean, I think it's time for the rest of the world to tell us something. But Michelle or Lisa, any comments on that? How do we get people to understand, or not get, how do we help people get to understand, but really deal with that, that tension? Or how did you deal with it, Mari? I mean, you were working on Northern Ireland, and you're...
I mean, I understand it well. Actually, I understand it even more from my students who, as I say, would come from 70 different countries. And one of the things I used to start the program off was by saying, you will never be the same again when you go home, and you will be a stranger when you go home. Because you will know more, you will have known more, you've made relationships, you will understand more. One of the lovely Irish word called strawn share, which is the idea of the stranger, the helpful stranger. And it's actually very interesting. It's a consolation for some people that in many places there are other helpful strangers who don't so totally belong to a group that they feel slightly free to ask questions. They feel free to work between groups, that they're confident in the fact that they can live with diversity, to live with the fact that things aren't certain, live with moving as a safe from place to place. So I think there is something about us as peace builders that needs to accept that in some ways, because we belong to all communities, we can't belong to one community. And that our delight and our role is very often between enabling people from different communities to actually hear each other. So my sense is that a lot of people will not take this work on because the cost is leaving their communities in some way. So I think the ability to move out into that space where you are a stranger, and where therefore being a stranger gives you freedom as well, if you're moving between communities. So I think that certainly is, and also I suppose the reality is that you can easily become a scapegoat. You can easily be challenged. I just wanted to go back a bit to say, to talk about the challenge between human rights and empathy. We had this all the time, and it exists in so many conflicts around the world. But the reality is The human rights people by themselves need people with empathy to help people talk about human rights. So you can't actually do one without the other. If you just talk and don't do human rights, you can't change, particularly for those who are oppressed. If you are just a human rights person, who's going to listen to what you say? Where are your contexts? How are things going to change? Unless there are people also enabling people to discuss human rights together. So in a sense, we are actually part and parcel of each other. And I think accepting that at different times, people play different parts. I was very impressed. One of my friends, we were working on Indonesia, and we were working on facilitation between the groups. And she came to me one day, she said, I'm giving up being a mediator. I want to go and become a human rights advocate for one of these groups that we were working with, because she said they need somebody to support them, to articulate what their needs are. And I thought she was so good to actually be able to step out of one role and into another. Both roles are needed, and we've got to find ways to help each other in terms of delivering what both need to deliver.
Beautifully said,
Michelle. Okay.
Beautiful.
Okay. There was another question that talks about how we're reporting on things in the media and trauma. And it really, one of the things they talk about is the January 6th messaging still is really around democracy. We're losing our democracy, and not also focused in on the, the fact that people died that day. And, so we're putting it into this bigger picture, but not talking about the real harm that was caused that day. It's kind of like it's in theory. And so I think that's what we're trying to ask is is that the right way to do it? Or why are we doing that in the media?
Well, I think the reason we're doing it right now is that the media has a different goal than we do. I mean, the media's goal is to segment us. It is to excite us and engage the emotions, and not empathy. It is designed to get loyalty to their particular platform. So we're seeing more and more outlets for news that are separate from news conglomerates, that do not have to get the clickbait that will drive people to come to their services. Many of those are nonprofits and B corporations.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the business model for the media right now is encouraging us to see things from that black and white and most outrageous perspective possible, and the least human perspective.
I think you're right. Unfortunately, we have segregated our media too. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
No, I was just going to add to that, capitalism is at play here. Those are very real dynamics. And we're so hyper-focused on the point of production and very much less focused on the point of consumption. And I think we need to be considering what's going on for the consumers of news, that they find themselves and construct for themselves echo chambers, the ways in which motivated reasoning plays into that, the way in which threat we see and scan for threat and all the information that we profile, and the ways in which we listen to leaders and norm setters who reinforce our worldviews, and what the intervention is that in fact targets that point of consumption rather than trying to tackle the massive world of production.
Okay, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're coming up on 3:30. Is there anything, again, read these books, Our Brains at War, Lisa's book, and also go to Beyond Conflict's website and read everything that's on there. I do. Are there any points that you wanted to kind of leave us with? Is there anything we missed?
There's hope that people can change, that societies can change. Oh, yeah, and thank you.
I just wanted to say, I think the AFP has really brought our field together in a way that I never conceived was possible a few decades ago. So I personally want to thank the AFP for the opportunity. Every time I read your newsletter, it is just so exciting to see how many things you're doing. So thank you, Liz, and to all who work with you, and Stephanie and all of the others.
I mean, we have to thank our members. We have to thank our strategic partners, and the people like yourselves, Mari, who saw this potential so many years ago and have just been incredible supporters of us. So I can't thank everyone else enough. But this is one of our big issues right now, is how do we rebuild our democracy, and how do we reduce violence. This is really, the important issue facing Americans, but also understanding that these issues are not new, and countries and regions have been experiencing them, and again, increasing violent conflict globally, impacting other issues like COVID and climate. Where I keep saying, we've humbly learned we are not exceptional. So it's great to be able to learn a lot of these lessons from overseas. I can't thank you all enough, Lisa, Michelle, Mari. As always, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.